Okay, welcome folks. We are continuing the discussion of Hume. In fact, this will be our last discussion of Hume in this series. And in this round, we're going to be looking at a different source. So, whereas earlier we were looking at passages from David Hume's Enquiry, specifically the first of the two enquiries concerning human understanding, this time around, we're going to look at another book. The first book Hume wrote, called A Treatise of Human Nature. And we're going to be looking at Hume's very famous discussion on personal identity. So here's the plan. I want to give a fast review of the question of personal identity. We will start to think about what you should think about personal identity if you are an empiricist like Hume. For a view to be empirically respectable for Hume, he's going to tell us that we need to make sure that all the ideas that we're referring to are in line with this view of the copy principle. The idea that every clear idea is going to be traceable back to some sense impression. And eventually this is going to get us to Hume's what we call a bundle theory of the self. And then we're going to see problems that Hume sees for other accounts of personal identity. And towards the end, we'll see some of Hume's positive proposals about personal identity. Often it's said that Hume has nothing to say about what personal identity is, although I think that there are some underlooked passages in his chapter on personal identity which maybe give us some hints about how Hume would sincerely answer the question of how is it that you can be the same person over time. So, the question of personal identity can be seen as a question of numerical identity. So we can say, how is X now the same X as then, right? So what we're thinking about when we think about the question of personal identity is the question of how something can be one and the same thing stretched out over time. So one point about numerical identity is this point that each thing in its own moment is identical to itself. So I myself exist right now, and we might say that is one individual self. So that is like a first step for thinking about numerical identity. We can then stretch it out a little further, and we can talk about diachronic personal identity. And when we're talking about diachronic personal identity, we are thinking about the question of, can a thing be identical to itself stretched out over time? Right? So we can ask this question, can a thing in a different instant be the same thing as previously? Now, it's really important to get distinct between the question of numerical identity, what it is to be one and the same thing, and to have all the same qualities. So, we might notice the example on the slide says this bit of chalk, but look here, I've got two black pens. These are both Pilot G2 pens with a .38 tip. Wonderful pens. We might say, like, look, these things are qualitatively identical if you don't look too close, right? But we might say these things are no different in their qualities across a number of dimensions, but we would not say that they are one and the same thing. Just to take one obvious observation, these things are in two different places at the same time, right? So we can say that these two things are qualitatively identical, but numerically distinct. But we can also talk about things like this. We can say, like, look, Socrates with a sunburn is not identical to how he was before. And we're going to put that in qualitative terms, right? We have this guy, his name is Socrates, and right now, at the moment, he is burnt rather than pale, right? But we would say, at least commonsensically, that Socrates stays the same guy, right? So he is one and the same individual in spite of the fact that, he has gone out of the pale phase and into the sunburnt phase, right? So we can have qualitative identity without numerical identity, and we can have numerical identity perhaps even without qualitative identity. So when we're asking the big question about personal identity, we're asking something like this. How is it that you are you, and that yourself is identical to, numerically identical to, your past self and your future self? We might even notice that your past self and your future self are going to be qualitatively different. So you might say that I am one and the same individual as I was 5 years ago, even though 5 years ago I had a little less gray in my beard. All right, now what are we talking about when we talk about being an individual with a self? Well, think way back in the course. If we think back to how Descartes thought about it, Descartes told us that to have a self is to be a thing that thinks, right? There must be something doing the thinking. There is something in which my thought inheres. Thought can't be done by nothing, and therefore, Descartes concludes, there is something that is doing the thinking. And for Descartes, to be a thing, and a thing with independent existence, and a thing that other things depend on for their existence, we need substances, right? So we're going to say, look, you are a thing that thinks. That is a substance. That is an independently existent entity, and we might say that it is within that substance events like thought occur. Now, here's how Hume comes back at this. When I quote Hume today, we'll have a Times font, distinct from the sans serif font. But here's what Hume is saying. He says, there must be some impression that gives rise to every real idea. That's just Hume's copy principle that we've learned about. But self or person is not any one impression, but that which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. So Hume is going to say, if you have an idea of the self, you should be able to copy it back to some experience. And he's going to say, look inside of yourself, right? Your perceptions are always changing. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad. Sometimes you're joyful, sometimes you're angry. Sometimes you're hot, sometimes you're cold, right? So no perception that you're having is permanent. And if we try to find an impression of this thing that we call the self, which is supposed to be constant, well, we don't find any constant impressions, right? So when we start to go on this search, Hume says, for an impression of the self, Hume says this: when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble upon some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. when my perceptions are removed for any time as by sound sleep, so long I am insensible of myself and may be said, and may truly be said, not to exist. So here we seem to have a point of agreement with Locke, right? Because here we're going to say that self is made of perception, right? We'll remember that Locke also told us that to have a self, to be a person, is to be a thinking kind of being, but the thoughts themselves constitute your thought, not the substance underlying them. Remember, Locke made this argument like, look, your thoughts could persist and your substance could change. Follow the thought, not the substance. Hume seems to be in agreement with this. He says, if you truly stop thinking, there is a sense in which you have no consciousness, and if you have no consciousness, there is no self. Hume goes on. If you have no constant impression of yourself, he's going to say, you are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. So now we see Hume pushing further. He's going to say not only is the self not some constant thing in you that you are aware of, it needs to be your thought, and moreover, the thought constitutes you, right? So we're going to say that the self is a bundle of impressions, right? So this is sometimes referred to as a bundle theory, right? That you bundle the perceptions together, and that's what makes the self. It might be remarked that this line of thought is remarkably similar to certain strains of thought in Buddhism, and maybe something that you'll hear if you meditate plenty. So sometimes your meditation coach or a meditation app might tell you, if you have a thought in your head while you're meditating, you might realize that the thought will think itself, right? You don't need to be the thinker that makes the thought, but rather a thought is its own thing, and you don't have to identify with it or not identify with it. That's what your meditation app might tell you. But, Hume is going to say, look, he's going to agree with this idea that thoughts think themselves. We don't need some separate substance to be thinking the self. But it's the series of thoughts that comprises your consciousness and yourself. So a self is just what it is to have a series of conscious thoughts. So here's how Hume puts it. He says, the mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. But notice here, and Hume makes this remark as soon as he gives the theater analogy, don't think of the mind as a physical space like a theater is a physical space. Maybe even in a more contemporary way, if Hume had seen movie screens, we might even say that, the self isn't even the theater, it's the series of images that is entering and exiting the view of the screen, right? So for Hume, he's going to say, look, your self is not a substance. Instead, we should think of it as a series of changing perceptions. So this is going to undercut theories of personal identity that ground it in substance. So Descartes tells us that what it is for you to be you is to be a thinking thing, a substance. We get a similar view, also notably from Leibniz, right? Leibniz is going to tell us that you are a substance with this infinite number of predicates. Well, he's going to say that what it is for you to be you is to be that substance. Well, Locke has already challenged this view, and now, maybe even a step further, Hume is going to press against it by giving us this bundle theory, this view that the changing series of perceptions isn't what the self does, it's what the self consists in. So, after Hume sort of offers this theory, he's going to say, well, what gets us to the other theory? Well, he says, when we think of things like plants and animals, we admit that they change in their qualities and their parts, right? So you could start with a tiny little sapling that grows into this big giant oak tree, right? So we have all these changes in quality, that is, qualitative aspects. The parts change, the molecules change, but we still say that, this tree is 100 years old, even though many of its parts are, have been part of the tree for much less time. So Hume says this. He says, in order to justify ourselves this absurdity that a thing is the same and different at the same time, what he's saying is like the same numerically, even though it's very qualitatively different. He says we feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. Thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of our senses to remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise the variation. So, tracking back to the Cartesian view, Hume is going to say that part of what we do is we assume that in spite of changes, we have one thing. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to make reference to something that we'll call a soul, right? So we might say that there is a soul or a life principle in a plant or an animal or in a human being. And this is the thing that we're keeping the same in order to, avoid the absurdity of, identity in spite of change. So in this way, he's going to say, here's, psychologically what we do and why we believe in souls. But Hume is going to say, ultimately, we can't justify this belief in souls. You've never seen a soul in the same way that you've seen a tree, right? And he's going to point out in that way, our idea of a soul doesn't trace back to any particular impression. It's a violation of the copy principle. So it's going to be what we might say is when we talk about souls, we're talking about souls without actually having any particular idea of what we're really talking about there. Now, he's going to keep building out here. So now that we've left behind the substance view, we can keep thinking about, for Hume, the psychology of ascribing numerical identity to things. He says, there are different factors that influence whether we allow something to count as the same thing, even though we're getting a bunch of qualitative changes. He says, here are some of the factors that play in. He's going to say proportion, right? So if I'm only changing a small part of something, little by little, you might say that it remains the same thing over time. Right. So now we're not talking about persons or plants or animals, but we could talk about something like a house, right? Where maybe 1 year you redo the kitchen, and then the next year you redo the flooring. And maybe the year after that, you get a new roof put on the house. Well, to some extent, you might think if you did all the renovations on a house the second it was built, you'd just be rebuilding a new house in the same place. But if you change out the kitchen 1 year and the roof the next year and reduce a bit of the flooring the next year, we might say it's the same house, even though it's changing in a number of ways. So we might say if you don't change too much all at once, people are generally tolerant of calling it the same thing. 2, gradualness of change. So not only that we're leaving enough, but that over time it's a slow amount of change. Hume is also going to say, if what is changing continues to have the same purpose, we might give it the pass for changing. So we get this famous example of the ship of Theseus. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. Here's the idea of the ship of Theseus. Every now and again, boards get old, the boards are taken out, and new boards are swapped in on this sailing ship. And eventually, over a number of years, so this actually speaks to gradualness and proportion to some extent, but we might say that over a certain number of years, all the boards are replaced out, right? Now, Hume says, sometimes people will still say that is the ship of Theseus, and they'll claim that it's still the ship of Theseus. One thing we might say is like, well, it was there to sail the Thessalian Sea, right? And we might say that it was serving that purpose all the time, and we might think that even though the parts are changing out, the purpose is still there, and that common end is a reason to talk about it as the same thing. In a similar way, think about bus routes. You can talk about, I got on the number 6 bus to go to school. Well, we might say that it might not even be the same bus at all, but we might say that, people will sometimes say it's the same bus or the same trip or the same route that I took before. Hume's going to point out, look, talking about a similar bus taking a similar route, we know it's not literally the same thing, although sometimes our language is a bit sloppy, right? So we can say I took the same bus to school on Tuesday as I did on Thursday. Similar to the point about common end or purpose, we can talk about sympathy of parts. So for an animal, like my dog, we might say my dog is one and the same thing, even though all the flesh and tissue gets changed out in my dog's body over a number of years. One thing that we might say is look, all these parts in my dog's body are doing the same thing, right? Or they're working towards the preservation of his little doggy life, right? So the sympathy of parts, we might say, is more important than preserving every single molecule in his body. Hume also points out that when we just expect a change to happen, we might even tolerate a great amount of change in something, and rather suddenly, just so long as it's normal and expected. So Hume gives us the example of a river, right? So he points out, for instance, that with a river, proportionally speaking and gradualness speaking, things are not looking good for the numerical identity of rivers, right? Because we might think look, a river is just made of water, and all the water that comprises a river currently is going to flow through it and out of it in the course of a day. So almost none of the water molecules in a particular segment of the Mississippi River today were there yesterday, right? But because we know that this is how rivers work, we might even tolerate rather large amounts of change if, there's nothing extraordinary about the water in the Mississippi River getting changed out quickly. So, Hume is going to say this. He says, the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. So part of what he seems to be saying here is, is yourself really the same self it was before? Well, he says, well, we sort of feign the idea of a self or a substance, or we make an agreement, right? The word fiction is kind of an interesting word for early modern thinkers. Fictions can sometimes mean something like a lie, but it can also mean something like an assumption for the sake of living and getting by. So we can talk about legal fictions. It's a legal fiction that the land was given to the king by God, right? So maybe what Hume is saying here is that we make a fictitious decision, which is to say we make maybe a not literally true agreement, but it's a working assumption that we will all buy into, to say, like, look, the Mississippi River today is the same river it was yesterday, even though we know that many of its parts are being swapped out constantly. Right? Similar thing with vegetables and animal bodies. The oak tree is not really the same thing at the level of chemistry and biology, but we can make the assumption that if we have things moving in a gradual and predictable series, we will allow ourselves to call them one and the same thing. Maybe a similar story with human beings, with persons. We are changing in various ways, but so long as the changes are gradual, expected, and maybe a certain sympathy of parts or plans is preserved, we can still say that's the same person, right? But Hume is going to point out, like, look, we are using the same psychological processes, right? Noticing proportion, gradualness, commonness of ends and purposes, sympathy of parts, looking for expected rather than unexpected changes. We are using these same kinds of psychological projects to ascribe diachronic identity to things like ships and trees. And we also use similar processes to talk about persons. So if we're using the same psychological processes to attribute sameness to these things, we're going to find similar metaphysical and epistemological statuses for them. That's the way in which everything is, to a certain extent, a kind of fiction. Now, Hume will give us some suggestions about, like, well, where does this leave us? What principles can we rightly ascribe for identity of persons? And Hume will actually go back to his principles of association, how you get from one thought to the next. So this is resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. Right? Now, Hume is actually going to rule out contiguity. He says that selves, especially selves over time within the same human body, can't be contiguous to one another. One exists at one time, and then the next one exists, and so on and so forth. So they can't be close to one another in space, right? Maybe they can be connected in time, but it seems like it's the space point that causes Hume to pass over contiguity. So that's going to leave us with resemblance and cause and effect. So we might say, look, there seems to be a certain resemblance relationship between certain bundles of perceptions that constitute one self to the next self. And here he's going to say, look, this is how memory might factor into personal identity, right? That by using your memory, you can call up certain moments from your past in your mind, and that memory is going to bear a resemblance to your actually having done the thing in the past, right? So in this way, we might say, like, look, when you remember something, you are repeating an experience, and that experience will bear a likeness to previous rememberings and the original experience, right? And then Hume is also going to say, it seems like we will also attribute a causal relationship in order to preserve personal identity. So, causation, that's one of our principles of association. Some thoughts will give rise to others. And he's going to say that, there is a similar way in which there are things causing you to be the way you are. And that can be true even if things are changing over time. And within the cause and effect frame of thinking, Hume says that he can't think of a better analogy between personal identity and the identity of a republic or a commonwealth. That is like a city, right? Here's the interesting thing about a city. Well, we can start to ask questions like, well, what makes something a city? Well, we might say it's a geographical location. It's created through certain legal understandings. So we've got that. And then we're going to say that it also preserves itself in time, even though the parts making it up. So we might say, like, look, a citizen might be one of the constituent parts of a city. Well, citizens will be born in and die out constantly. That's kind of like your mind as well. Certain thoughts and even habits of thoughts will come in and die out throughout the course of your life. The laws of a city can change, its constitution, its characteristics, even its borders, right? But it's going to remain the same thing because of a causal history, right? So right now, I'm in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Well, for this place to be the same city it once was, is to stand in a certain causal relationship with, previous versions of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, through not just the 21st century, but the 20th and the 19th and so forth, right? So, maybe this is a helpful way for thinking about the nature of the soul, right? It's a grouping of things. It's not just one thing. And yourself, isn't requiring any one particular thing to stay the same, but it's many things changing. But we tolerate these changes so long as we recognize a certain causal history tying all these things together. There's an interesting thought here. Maybe Hume is even suggesting that the way your body, your mind, and your brain work together, well, that's ultimately a causal story. And once we start thinking about that kind of causal story, you can think about a person as being the same individual that they once were, even though there is no one essential substance part, and even though the thoughts that you might be having are changing quite a great deal. So, in this way, Hume is not just repeating Locke's theory that treats the self as continuity of consciousness. He points out, for instance, you don't seem to think that as soon as you forget something, that stops being you. So he's going to say, for instance, that even if you don't remember putting on your shoes this morning, it was you who put on your shoes, right? So he does flag this point against the continuity of consciousness view, that gaps in memory seem to be a problem for that theory, right? What Hume thinks is going on is this. He says, we are individuals and we have selves that we seem to admit persist over time. And he points out that a memory can discover identity relations, right? So I might realize that it was me. Let's think of something that I did. So I can think it was me who moved from Texas to North Carolina about 5 years ago. That was right at the end of 2018 for me, right? And we can say, look, I might notice that there is the same guy driving that truck from Texas to North Carolina in 2018. The fact that I'm remembering it doesn't keep that identity relation in place. That identity relation would be in place whether or not I was thinking about it or remembering it, right? But when I do remember having done these things, Hume is going to say that that's a very helpful way to discover an identity relation, even though that doesn't produce an identity relation. Right? So this is going to be Hume's approach. We're going to say, can we see enough causal connection between what you once were and what you are now? That's going to be one way of getting personal identity for Hume. The other thing is going to be like, look, is there enough resemblance? So we might say like, look, if your mind and thought characteristics changed so much that you no longer resembled your previous self, well, maybe we would say that's no longer you. This is quite a pertinent question when we're thinking about something like Alzheimer's disease, right? If your thinking and your personality change so drastically, sometimes people will say, this is so far removed from what, this loved one of mine once was, that they're not the same person anymore, right? But this leads us to Hume's last question, which is, if we're going to start asking the question not of like whether there is a soul or some substance that makes you you, says we've already set that aside. But if we start to ask the question, how much resemblance between your previous self and your past self do we need to preserve identity? Or how much resemblance or how much of a cause and effect relationship do we need between your past self and your current self to preserve personal identity? Here, Hume is going to say that we are dealing with a verbal dispute. So here's what Hume says. He says that the whole of this doctrine, once we figure out what we're dealing with when we deal with personal identity and how we think about it, leads us to a conclusion which is of great importance to the present affair. That is, that all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided. So I think that Hume is thinking specifically about the question, like, how much like your previous self does your current self have to be in order for you to stay you? Right, we've already set aside this substance hypothesis that Descartes gives us, and now we're just talking about a bundle of perceptions. Well, when do we stop calling this one bundle that keeps on changing a lot no longer the same bundle? Right? Hume says these questions can never be decided and should be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. Identity depends on the relation of ideas, and these relations produce identity, that's cause and effect and resemblance for Hume, by means of that easy transition they occasion. But as the relations and the easiness of the transition may diminish by insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose a title to the name of identity. So part of what Hume seems to be saying here is that, we might say that like A and B are distinct things. So just to take a really concrete example, we might point out, for instance, this is your grandfather when your grandfather was 20 years old. And at 95, your grandfather perhaps is suffering from really severe dementia. And, it's a terrible thing to go through, but, you might realize that when a person is in extreme late-stage dementia, they might not have any of their same personality traits. They might not have memory of people's names. They might not be able to recall things about themselves when they were 20. Now, Hume seems to be pointing out that, well, maybe, here when grandpa is 60, we might say at this point, there is still a lot of connection. But, once we start getting into the progression of dementia, we might say it's kind of arbitrary to put the line here for where grandpa stops being grandpa versus here or there. Right? So this is where he's saying, like, look, we have this diminution of the relations that constitute personal identity by insensible degrees. Right? Now, he's going to say that we can't say, oh, it's exactly here where grandpa stops being himself. Right? And in this way, Hume is basically saying, look, when we start having this argument about, where personal identity begins and stops, when we're thinking in terms of these relations between certain resembling and less resembling parts, he says that's a verbal dispute, or that's a grammatical dispute. When we're dealing with verbal disputes in philosophy, we're not really arguing anymore about the precise nature of things, right? We're just arguing about how to use words. So for instance, you're probably not going to get anywhere in an argument with somebody if you argue about whether bowling is a sport, right? The argument about whether bowling is a sport is basically an argument about how we're going to use the word sport. It's not really an argument about the nature of bowling, which in a good argument about this matter, like all the facts about what bowling is like are going to be evident. Right? But these questions about when do you stop being you, Hume is going to say these are not true metaphysical debates. Instead, they're going to be debates about words, right? But it does leave us with a certain question, right? How much similarity, are we usually working with when we do ascribe personal identity? And to what extent can we, sort of talk about myself and my interests into the future, even when we stop believing in personal identity in some Cartesian metaphysical sense, or when we stop thinking that there's a clear answer to the question of where we draw the lines here. So, with that, I think that this gives us a picture of Hume's bundle theory of the self and his alternate approach, let's say, to the question of what it is for you to be you over time. So thanks for listening in today. And as always, do be in touch if there's anything you need to get in touch with me about. Take care.